Today, I'm going to show you a tutorial to build a continuous deployment pipeline for a Google Cloud Function using GitHub Actions. This Cloud Function will be triggered from an HTTPS endpoint and will be written in Typescript. To get started, make sure you have a Google Cloud account and you've created a project with a billing account attached. This tutorial will not cost any money, but you will need a billing account. The first thing we're going to do is create a new Cloud Functions. So from the search bar or from the navigation menu, go to the Cloud Function page. Create a new function. And I'm going to call this SAM tutorial function. My region can be the US Central 1 region, that is the closest to me. Trigger type is HTTP. We want to allow unauthenticated invocations. This will make it public. Require HTTPS is checked by default. Leave that and click Save. We can leave the runtime build connections and security settings to default and click Next. Cloud Functions will create a new testing function by default. You may need to enable a Cloud Build API. If you see that prompt, make sure to click Enable API. Let's deploy this function to be our testing baseline function. Something to note is that we are using the Node.js 14 runtime. We will have to keep that in mind once we build our pipeline. The next step is to create a new GitHub repository. If you don't have a GitHub account, make sure to create one first. I'm going to create a new repository. I'm going to call it SAM Cloud Function CD tutorial. I'm going to make mine public because I will share this in the description of the video. And I'm going to create repository. This will create a blank repository that will house our code and our deployment pipeline. Now we're going to start developing locally. So let's clone this repository to our local machine and open it in VS Code. To clone a GitHub repository, I'm just going to copy the SSH URL. Assuming you have Git installed and you've authenticated to your GitHub profile, I can do a git clone and then that URL. The tutorial is empty by default because there's nothing in there yet, a brand new repository. I'm going to open this directory in Visual Studio Code. Okay, now that we have our repository open in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to scaffold out the file structure that we will need for this process. First, I'm going to make a new folder called source. This is going to house all of our TypeScript code. I'm going to make a new folder called .github. This is going to house our GitHub workflows. And inside of that .github directory, I'm going to create a new directory called workflows. I'm also going to create a .git ignore file and a tsconfig.json file. Back in my terminal, in the root of this repository, I'm going to run npm init-y. This will initialize a new Node.js project in this directory. The -y will auto approve all of the prompts just to make it a little bit easier for us. This will create a package.json file in the root. Now I'm going to write a brief TypeScript function that we will use for our deployment. To do that, in our source directory, I'm going to make a new file called index.ts, and this is going to be the main entry point or the main file for our project. Now, because we are using TypeScript and I am going to need some types, I'm going to install a couple of libraries. Google Cloud Functions, when it passes a request and response object to TypeScript, will wrap it in an express data type. So I'm going to npm install express, and I'm going to npm install save dev types express. This will give us the correct request and response types for our function. I'm going to start by importing those. And then I'm going to create my main function. So I'm going to export const main, which I'm going to make an async function. And this is going to take in a rec, which is a request, a res, which is a response, and it's not going to return anything. It's going to be a promise void type. Now, just to make this very simple, I'm going to do something basic. I'm going to take my response object. I'm going to send hello from my main function. So what that will do, once the main function is invoked, it will simply return the string hello from my main function back to the user. The next step is going to be creating the GitHub Actions workflow file. I'm going to make a new file here called deploy.yaml, and this lives inside of the workflows directory. This is the YAML spec that will define our GitHub Actions workflow. I'm going to call it Cloud Function Deployments. We need to think about when we want this job to run. For this tutorial, we're going to make this job run every time there's a push to the master branch. So to denote that, I can say on push branches, and then a list of branches, and here we're just going to put master. And now I'm going to define the jobs that we want to run for this workflow. I'm going to name this job deploy cloud function. To begin, let me just start filling in this job. I need to run it on a specific type of machine. Next, we'll define the steps that this job requires. We'll start with the basic step of checking out our code base. So it's going to be actions/checkout at v2. After that, we're going to authenticate to Google Cloud. I'm going to give this the ID of auth in case I need to refer to it later on. And Google exposes an action for us to use for this use case. Google-GitHub-actions/auth at v0.4.1. I'm going to use a with command because I need to tell it which set of credentials it's going to use to authenticate. And I'm going to give it a credentials JSON file. This doesn't exist yet, but I will put it in my GitHub secrets called Google Credentials. And this will be a JSON file for a service account key with the required access to make our deployment. The next thing we need to do is set up our Node.js environment. I'm going to call this setup node, and this is going to use actions/setup node v1, and I'm going to set the node version to 14. After this, I'm going to run an npm install command to install our dependencies and run the tsc command to transpile our TypeScript. After this, we are ready to deploy. I'm going to call this deploy. And Google also exposes a GitHub Actions that we can use for this specific use case. Google-GitHub-Actions/deploy cloud functions version v0.6.0. And now I need to provide it some information. The name of the function, which I forgot, so let us check really quickly. This function is called SAM tutorial function. So let me just grab that text and copy it in there. Our runtime is Node.js 14. So now we need to define our source directory. This is going to be where our JavaScript code lives after it's been transpiled from our TypeScript. So I know that I'm going to define my tsconfig in such a way that it will create a dist directory where my JavaScript code will live. So my source directory is going to be that dist directory. And the entry point into the function is that main function. This needs to match your main entry point. This file is good to go. We have a few other steps before we are able to actually test it. The first thing we want to do is define our TypeScript build. To do that, I'm going to install TypeScript as a dependency to this project, and then I'm going to define my tsconfig file. I've grabbed my local copy of this file. The two things that I want to point out here is the module. We are using CommonJS, and our out directory is that dist directory. Now I'm going to update my git ignore to ignore the node modules directory and the dist directory. I do not want to commit transpiled code. Now let's test our tsconfig.json file just to make sure things are building the way that we want. To do that, let's open our terminal, again in the root of our repository, and type tsc. This will transpile our TypeScript to JavaScript. We have an error here, which is fair. We have a variable declared, but its value is never read. We have two options here. Either A, we can find a way to read this variable inside of our function, or we can update our tsconfig.json to make that allowed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log out that request object. That way it will fulfill that standard, and we can debug this request later on from the console in case we need to. Let's transpile our code again. Looking at the project, it has created a dist directory and an index.js file. Don't worry about this code. This is going to be a lot to look at, but this is the JavaScript equivalent of this TypeScript code that we have defined. Now that our project is set up, we have to create Google Cloud credentials to do the deployments. If we recall in the deploy.yaml file, we have this auth action looking for this Google credentials secrets. Let's create that next. Going back to the Google Cloud Console, navigate to the IAM page. On the left side, go down to the Service Accounts page and create a new service account. This service account will be used to do our deployments. I'm going to call this GitHub Deployments, just to be explicit in the name. And just to make our life easier, I'm going to give it owner access to my project. This will allow it to make any changes in my Google Cloud platform. I'm going to click Create and create that service account. And now we see it here on the list. We can click in to that service account, go to Keys, and this is where we need to create a new key that we will upload to GitHub that it will use for the deployment. So we can click Add Key, and we will create a new key type of JSON, and this will download the key to your local computer. Make sure to hold on to this key securely. Do not commit it in your repository. Now we need to enter the key data into our GitHub secrets. So I'm going to go back to my GitHub repository, go to Settings, scroll down to Secrets, and I'm going to create a new repository secret. I'm going to call this Google Credentials. Look at that, it's automatically completed for me. And the value is going to be the value of this JSON file. If you're on a Mac, the easiest way to do that is to do a cat command to that file that was downloaded and pipe that into pbcopy. This will take that JSON data and copy it to your clipboard. Perfect. Our Google credentials have been uploaded. Let's make sure we can test the deployment correctly. Let's go back to our Cloud Functions page in the console, click on the new function we've created, go to the Triggers tab, and copy this URL. This is the URL used to invoke our function. You can either open that URL in your browser and see the baseline hello world text that we deployed, or you can run a curl command from your terminal with that URL. Now that we have a way to test the function, let's run our deployment pipeline. Going back to my code base and my terminal, I'm going to check our git status just to make sure that we commit everything that we want to. Everything looks good. So I'm going to git add dot to add all of my changes in the directory and commit this with the tag initial commit. If I could spell commit correctly. And then I'm going to push this up to GitHub. Git push. Now let's go back to our GitHub repository. Click on the actions page. And we will see that there is actually an error with this action. This is something I actually do quite a bit, is I use the word users instead of uses. My bad. Let me remove that R and push this to GitHub. And now if we check our actions page again, we can see if there is another pipeline. There we go. So this orange-ish yellow dot is telling us that it's queued. We can click into the workflow, click into our job, and watch it run. So it just finished transpiling our TypeScript, and now it's doing the deploy cloud function action. There we go. This pipeline has finished successfully with the green check. So let's try our curl command one more time. There we go. But if we try it a second time, it did update. Sometimes there is a bit of latency between when we update our function and when it is available to us. And just to finish this off, I'm going to make one more change in the code so we can see that continuous deployment happen. If I go back to my index.ts file, instead of sending just some string, let's say that this is actually an application and you wanted to return some data. So let's return something, some arbitrary data. ID is 1, name is Sam, message is hello. This .json function will return this JSON object back to the user who initiated the request. So let's add this, push it, and then once again, wait for our action to complete. And we will see our new workflow running. Let's wait for this to finish. And there we go. This function was deployed correctly. We will see a green check mark on our workflow. Perfect. And let's make this curl request one more time. And there we have it. So it does take a few minutes to fully update, but that is that JSON representation that we updated in our code. All we did was update our code, push to GitHub, wait a minute and a half, and the new function was deployed. I hope you learned a lot. Again, this repository is linked in the description for your review, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.